everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is Saturday, the 7th of June. The planet Venus has recently ingressed into the sign of Taurus, where it is in a square aspect to Pluto and Aquarius. This is a fixed square between, obviously, Taurus is fixed Earth. It's the place where Venus is in good domicile position. So Venus is well dignified in this square to Pluto in Aquarius. The inspiration for where I'm going with this comes partly in just going with the flow that I'd already established in my last video, where I have to admit, thank you for putting up with me lamenting my lack of popularity or my lack of, I think I made some choices in terms of my choice of content in these videos recently, which was not very algorithm friendly, and I'm not even monetized too, right? I realize there's a whole range of things, areas which may be tricky to talk about, but there's something about that whole process of censorship, selection, repression, which is actually indicative of the Pluto archetype itself, right? Because often Pluto stands for a kind of power and control and manipulation that very much goes with this way of that there are some things which are much more easily spoken about openly and up front, and other things which naturally lend themselves to the forces of repression, oppression, depression, control, and manipulation, right? But however, some of these things, basically, like I was mentioning, I realized that the Pluto archetype started to sneak in, the Venus-Pluto thing started to sneak into my last video with the inclusion, for example, of talking about the song Venus and Furs from the Velvet Underground's first album with Velvet Underground and Nico. Venus and Furs, of course, being a song about sadomasochism. There's apparently a book about that was from, I haven't read the book, but there's sort of like bondage BDSM kind of thing that kind of goes with a Venus-Pluto square. And I mean, the song even has Venus in the title, so that's one thing, right? There's also certain dynamics where I started talking about the F. Scott Fitzgerald's Crackup, which is basically, I have accomplished within recent years the feat of reading all of this book, 1,000 Plateaus, and one of the things about Deleuze and Guattari is that they have this reputation for being very difficult to read because they draw a lot of references to other areas of writing, other pieces of source material, and I was lucky enough, or at least in that world enough already, that enough of those pieces of source material were relevant enough to me that I was already familiar with them, so it wasn't completely alien and foreign to me, right? So that, by being familiar with some of it, you can kind of fill in the blanks with the stuff that you aren't familiar with, right? But nonetheless, they're in the process of this. There's so much material that I wasn't familiar with that by spending all this time reading those books, it had kind of, there's certain authors that, let's say, if I had gone to a neighborhood library box, I would have perhaps overlooked because there would have been nothing about them to catch my attention as being significant, right? So, like, to give you an example, recently I investigated a local neighborhood library box, and actually, you know what, to be fair, I saw this book in the library box, and I hesitated when I first saw it, because there was something about the fact that it a ghost story, a horror story, and had a kind of a connection with the material that I was reading. That it was something about, was this going to be too heavy, too scary, too shocking, too horrifying to handle? And well, I mean, the book, what it was this book, Turn of the Screw by Henry James. And to be fair, I went back and looked at the Deleuze and Guattari book, and it was actually a different Henry James story that they talk about, a Henry James story called In the Cage. Now, Henry James, apparently the guy was a closeted homosexual. Make of that what you will. But what's interesting about Turn of the Screw is that, first of all, in this book, it's interesting because this is a novella, or it's somewhere between a short story and a novel. You can consider it maybe similar length to something like a Kafka story, like the one where he turns into a bug, the Metamorphosis or something. It's kind of similar to that. What's interesting about Turn of the Screw is that there's something about Venus-Pluto dynamic right now where, just to put it bluntly, there's a certain, you can sort of see it show up where accusations of like Donald Trump's being friends with Jeffrey Epstein and the whole web of blackmail, power and control, all that kind of stuff that goes with what the Epstein project or whatever they were doing. And there's also, I guess nobody really talks about QAnon anymore, but it is to me it seems fairly obvious that QAnon was just an elaborate attempt to somehow deflect that problem. There's obviously, like, I don't know if it's true or not. I mean, but if it is true, this is obviously a flaw in the armor, right? And that in some way they're like somehow rather than being critically minded and looking at that flaw for what it was, it seems fairly obvious maybe that something like QAnon could have been an intentional attempt to deflect away from that problem by creating a kind of a fantastical narrative in which the opposite is actually true, basically. That instead of Donald Trump being part of the problem of elites who were mixed up in that stuff, that he was actually a guy who's heroically, going to expose all the other elites, and he's actually working on the side of good, not evil, in a very Manichaean, dualistic kind of way, right? But there's something about all this which I think there's also the way that it was remarkable to watch the way that whole scene with QAnon was almost kind of like an addictive drug for the people that were really into it, right? Because there's something about, and I think a lot of this has to do with the conservative attitude towards things like disgust, humiliation, shock, extreme polarities of positive and negative emotions and stuff like that. And there's something about or taboo, the act of repression, right? And there's something about the Turn of the Screw as a book, which is just what makes it the most interesting is primarily the fact that it works off the mechanism of repression, or the mechanism of taboos and stuff like that, in the sense that in the commentary on this, they present it as if Henry James, in his own words, writing about this, says that the story was actually inspired by a real ghost story, which was going, apparently, imagine this, back in the day, back in this Victorian era, ghost stories were things that were like urban folk tales in the sense that they traveled by gossip or by word of mouth, right? And so he sets up the story in such a way where he has a bunch of people gathering together to talk about something as if it were like a piece of gossip. And then this is like the setup for it. And then he switches the narrator position where you are now in the story that these other people are talking about from the point of view of the protagonist of the story, who is a Victorian governess, which is basically similar to a babysitter, I suppose you could say. Or I think it's also, if you're familiar with that old children's show Mary Poppins, there's something about the Mary Poppins character which is very similar, where you're basically like a nanny or a babysitter, and the whole story centers around this woman who's a nanny or a babysitter to look after these two children, and their father is away on business and is basically completely absent, and that the prior to this person being selected to be the babysitter or the nanny or the governess, as they say, there was prior woman in that job who's not there anymore, as well as a person who was kind of, I don't know, I want to say, I just want to use the word groundskeeper, because I'm thinking of Groundskeeper Willie in The Simpsons, because apparently this guy seemed to be of a similar demeanor in terms of, if you considered the groundskeeper to be of a different class, or there's a certain racial dynamic too, where the groundskeeper Willie was Irish and had red hair, and that this guy had red hair. And so basically the plot of this is that the ghost story is that these servants, the servant class who aren't there anymore, are now appearing as ghosts and haunting the family, or basically haunting the governess, who's the protagonist of the story, and the two children she has to look after. And this is basically the setup. But what's interesting, the dynamic about this, is that it's basically implied that there's this whole kind of, what's interesting about this is that Henry James is never going to say it outright, but play with the idea of repression, or play with the thing about that. If you can imagine that this is a story that's going around as a piece of gossip, and that there is the idea of, first of all, the topic of ghosts, right? Of whether or not ghosts are real or not real, or whether it's something that you talk about and play conversation or not. But then there's also the conversation about all sorts of sexual stuff that is also, especially in the Victorian area, as you can imagine, would be the subject to a lot of repression or taboo, or things you just don't talk about. And then you can also maybe start filling in the blanks that apparently Henry James himself was a gay guy who was closeted, or at least this is a period of time where it was not so common to be out of the closet as being gay or something. And there's also this whole kind of thing about the controversies around things like sexual education, or the fact that it's just like people just weren't educated, or like there's a sense that whole area was a kind of a source of awkwardness, right? And what's also interesting is that this is directly before Sigmund Freud basically became popular with the whole id, Oedipus, all this kind of stuff. And then from that, this is basically where Deleuze and Guattari come into this, as writing a critique about all this sort of thing about Freudian id, the shadow, the repression, all this kind of stuff. And there's something about the, you could approach this from a very specific way, where you're talking about the Sigmund Freud perspective, where you've got the id, the ego, the superego, and you have your conscious thing that's talked about, that's shared, and then you've got the id, or the shadow, as all the contents which are repressed, right? And that, if you consider, what's kind of interesting about this is that they use this dynamic in a lot of things like horror movies, like the whole dynamic where you have a couple that might be like necking in a car or something, and then they get interrupted by the crazy axe murderer, right? Or you have the kids in summer camp, and they sneak out of the cabins to go meet up at night, and then they get attacked by the murderer or something like that. Like there's something about how, but this is archetypically, you could say this is a very Venus-Pluto thing, because there's this thing about like fear, paranoia, suspicion, conspiracy, even what's something covered up or secret or danger, versus the survival, or the fact that your libido is wired into the survival drive, right? Where you are biologically programmed to reproduce, to perpetuate the species and have children, and then for some reason at the unconscious level there's all this unconscious stuff that's just mixed up. But it's only mixed up. The thing is, when you, this is where I'm going, I figured this would be an opportunity to get into Deleuze and Guattari, because there's something about all this where they are, by the move that they make, by being what you might say post-structuralist or deconstructivist, is to say that we don't have to just take this Freudian thing as if it's like some kind of metaphysical truth, but rather we can go further than that and start to pick that apart and see other things in it. And from here we'll introduce the Deleuze-Guattarian idea of the segment, right? And the segment basically is, the segment doesn't necessarily have to do with anything that is all that controversial, right? Although there is a range, there could be a range where the controversial things are included into it, right? But if you take, for example, the idea of the segmentation between work and leisure, or home life and work life, right? There is often this kind of dynamic with Pluto as a kind of a force of repression that, let's take for example, like a husband is, we're going to stick with some very heteronormative gender roles here, but in this example, the husband is at work, had a hard day at work, and he comes home and he is sick and tired of his job, but he just wants to have a nice hot meal, but doesn't want to get upset at his wife or something like that if it's not ready on time or something like that. This is the typical dynamic between like domestic conflict, right? Is that I work so hard and this is what I get kind of thing, right? But it could be that there's some kind of drama going on in the workplace, and that at home, the world of the wife and the children, they're not really directly connected to this because it's not their business, right? And that the Pluto dynamic with, this is one thing with Aquarius too. I grew up with my dad was Aquarius, and my dad was the kind of guy who would often say, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, right? And so there's this kind of idea that, like, if you at your place of work have to deal with all these difficult things going on, that the Pluto and Aquarius principle as a higher virtue is that to create a kind of a boundary between, or a segment. It's not even like a segment isn't even necessarily a hard boundary where everything's completely walled off, but to say that if our home is a sanctuary, it's a peaceful container to offer an area of respite after a hard day's work, and that if you bring in the bad spirit of the drama from the workplace into the quiet, tranquil home environment, then what that manifests in usually ends up being something like domestic conflict, where the wife is not doing anything wrong, is actually maybe doing the best she can to be a support for her husband, but yet the husband resents her because there's this problem that the wife can't do anything about, right? Aside from provide a support. And so instead of the husband is under this mentality that he has to separate the workplace dramas, the workplace conflicts from the home environment, and then let the home environment be the home environment. But then it becomes a point where instead of being able to tell the wife about what is on his mind, about what he's stressed out about, it becomes about, if you just look at the home environment for what it is, the issue is the food ready on time? Is the food prepared? Is the wife doing a good job? And that if the wife isn't doing a good job, it's not the wife's job to know about what's going on in the office, right? It's not the wife's job to have an opinion about the office drama. It's the wife's job to make the food on time. And so any little micro infraction of if the wife is not performing her household duties becomes a source of resentment from the husband, and the husband unleashes his masculine rage. I have to put up with this drama that you don't want to hear about it. You don't want to hear about all that whole mess back at work. I'm doing you guys a favor, and all I expect is to have my food ready on time. This becomes the segmentation between home and office, home life, work life, that kind of thing, right? You see what I'm saying here, right? With that in mind, this whole dynamic, there is also the segmentations of what goes on in the bedroom, right? What goes on, or your private affairs that you don't want to have public and all this kind of stuff. And like the birds and the bees, and teaching the kids about all that kind of stuff as they go through puberty with proper sexual education, or using contraceptives so they don't get pregnant, or whatever it may be, right? And there's this whole range of what is a man's world, what is a woman's world, what is for adults and what is for children, and that if these, there's a problem about the post-structuralists, the French theorists, where they're often scapegoated as being a bunch of dirty perverts or whatever, right? Or that this is basically all what they're talking about. But the point is that if you look at the process of segmentation, could be as mundane or as simple between what goes on in the home versus what goes on in the office, or it could go what goes on in the public sphere of what is polite conversation, what is talked about, versus what goes on in some billionaire's private jet where he feels like he's flying, he's in the Mile High Club, miles above everybody else in this elite privileged world where he gets to do what he wants without having to worry about but then that is used as a power dynamic for all these shadowy forces of coercion and control, right? So you could quickly, the point of Deleuze and Guattari is that the ideas are extensive. The idea of the segmentation applies to all sorts of things, and then there are all sorts of, there's also, it's interesting how this world of the repression of what might be called gender or sex or whatever is also mixed up with things that could be with not even related to that, like different shadowy government power dynamics, or speaking of which, another, this wasn't more like last year. I was going for a walk on the other side of town, investigating other neighborhood library boxes, and I found this, which is a hardcover book. Doesn't have the jacket or illustration, but it does. If you look at this, it is the report on unidentified flying objects by Doubleday. This is a classic piece of UFO fiction, although apparently I haven't really gone too deep in this, but there's this question about how is anything in here actually real, or is this an elaborate piece of disinformation, a fake, or a way to sow seeds of confusion, of conspiracies and stuff like that, right? And there's I also, just to contrast that, I also found this one, Soul Food by Jack Kornfield, and this is more of an example of just like a feel-good self-help book, and I don't know, I may trade this one back into the ecosystem of neighborhood library boxes, but this is one thing where every time I think about giving this one back, I pick it up and I open it up and I find a heartwarming story to restore your faith in humanity, right? So I think it's maybe helpful to balance it out with some hopeful things and not just get too black-pilled conspiracy theorist or whatever. I don't know why I'm throwing that one in, just to balance it out a little bit, right? Just to say that it's not all just, my neighborhood isn't all just full of a bunch of people who are reading weird ghost stories or something, right? Like there's maybe some more optimistic things going on in the neighborhood, right? But nonetheless, there's also the theme here of why I'm bringing this up is not just this. I mean, it's obviously been brought up in the current context of the drama between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, as Elon Musk has brought this up that Trump may be, everybody kind of knows that this is a factor, that Trump this may be why he's doing certain things like redirecting the attention to the JFK files, but keeping the Epstein files tightly secured or something like that. I mean, most people can read between the lines. Like, you don't have to. Or there's a lot of rumors going around about certain things around this that I'm. My job isn't here to try to substantiate any of that, but rather to look at this dynamic in the idea of the power agreement between the characters of Trump and Elon Musk has been described as them going through a breakup right now. But you could also use the word crackup, right? And in my last video, I mentioned why I brought the Henry James thing up was that Henry James appears in this book in a chapter, a Plateau, called Three Novellas, or What Happened. And the first novella isn't Turn of the Screw, it's In the Cage. The second novella is The Crackup by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is the author of The Great Gatsby. And the third one is this one about the abyss and the spyglass by Pierre Fluteau. Is that how you say his name? I don't know. But because this is not a very long piece of writing, so I figured I would read this from 1,000 Plateaus at the risk of creating what might be called a Deleuzian astrology video. But I hesitate to call myself a Deleuzian because what I've noticed is that to be a Deleuzian typically means that you're like an academic, and that what you do is that you specialize on understanding Deleuze and in teaching classes on how to better understand Deleuze and all that kind of stuff, and that you're primarily in that kind of milieu where you are a Deleuzian means that you are an expert on this guy named Deleuze. And what I'm doing here is to see the archetype of Pluto in Aquarius, right? What do people talk about when they're talking about Pluto and Aquarius these days? And I'm not talking about what I talk about. I'm talking about just astrologers in general. Well, what I've noticed that is, in general, there are certain themes brought up, such as transhumanism, right? How do you define the human for the non-human? Technological accelerationism, when combined with transhumanism, what is the boundaries of what define the human? What are the politics of going beyond that? Whether that is extending the longevity of human life, or whether that is, oftentimes it gets caught up with a gender binary or non-binary conversation. But these are just certain directions, trailheads that you could push into if you want to, right? But there's also this question about the Techno-Singularity. There's this question about the control society. There's this question about AI. There's a question about media and changing media environments, about the disruption. And basically, this is where it really comes in. Capitalism, the disruption of AI on employment, right? About the idea that apparently... Well, I mean, you see this coming. I've worked a lot of jobs that could easily be displaced by a restructuring, right? Like the question of, like, you can buy the same stuff off Amazon, or else you could go to a store where people are employed working at the checkout or as salesmen to tell you about the differences and like to help guide the customer to a purchase decision, to try to sell them on upgrades, or that stuff could all just be automated and redesigned so that these people don't have jobs or whatever, right? These are all political issues that are very much centered around what people talk about with the Aquarius being technological, about being the, or also maybe as the water bearer, being like in a time of great change and uncertainty, maybe the Aquarian water bearer is holding the water, the container of humanity. What does it mean to be a human in a changing landscape when all of this is under question, right? And that the question, there's also the archetype of the Crackup, which exists in that definition of what it means to be human, right? The idea that what if there is, in our conception of humanity, there exists a crack that exists in there, and that we have this fear of fragmentation. We want to maintain a sense of common unity in universality that could be described maybe in the popularity of the perennial philosophy that everything is all one, we all share, the whole geosphere shares a common kind of humanity and we're all working together, versus the question that our humanity is going through a crack up and that we're headed into a transhuman time. Or also we could look at our leaders, right? That our leaders are in power. There's a certain arrangement of power, which could be described as neoliberalism, that regardless of what you say about Donald Trump, you may not like this organizational principle of neoliberalism, and you can see that neoliberalism itself is now going through a crack up, and that Donald Trump is acting to be like a hammer that is like this crushing blow that's disrupting the force of neoliberalism. Right? I think these are all dynamics in which Pluto and Aquarius could be seen as the kind of because there's this thing about the micro and the macro, and that the idea that there could be very small things which are actually very powerful, and that you could say that, like with Pluto and Aquarius, it could be, or they talk about Uranus as the breakthrough, the sudden breakthrough. Pluto could be like the hairline fracture, right? This weakness that, like, it may be too small to notice, but it's enough that this hairline fracture under more stress, it's like when you have a chip in when you have like a little thing in your windshield when you're driving your car, and it gradually like expands and expands to be this big crack, and you got to get your windshield replaced. It's kind of the thing about Donald Trump and Elon Musk is that it was a chipped windshield from the beginning. Everybody knew that there was this crack in the windshield, or that you could even say the same thing with like J.D. Vance, because J.D. Vance originally was not really that big of a fan of Donald Trump. That could be the next one, right? But we could be seeing a crack up of the neoliberal power organization, a crack up of the Trump administration, a crack up of global politics, or even the crack up of late stage capitalism itself, right? With this in mind, and with in mind the extensiveness of this idea, I will read this piece from 1,000 Plateaus. On the Crackup by F. Scott Fitzgerald. What happened? This is the question Fitzgerald keeps coming back to toward the end, having remarked that, of course, all life is a process of breaking down. How should we understand this, of course? We can say, first of all, that life is always drawn into an increasingly rigid and desiccated, dried out, segmentarity. For the writer Fitzgerald, voyages with their clear-cut segments had lost their usefulness. For example, the whole thing about Odysseus in these myths is you've got this guy who has the homesickness of being far away from home, and that whole archetype. If you take this back into the pre-modern era and the myth of being home or away, of the journey back, the return, is all built around the necessity of a segmentation, right? The barrier, like in the same way that the modern man has this segment between the home life and the workplace, or the going off on the adventure versus coming back home, that kind of thing. They need to have if they become too dried out and brittle, they lose their usefulness. It becomes this dead thing that doesn't actually have any meaning or vitality, right? Especially, like, you can see this if you're working from home, or like if you start being this thing, I'm just going to like not have an office to go to, I'm just going to do all my work at home, then there is no actual the segmentary difference between doing something at home or doing work at the office is null and void, right? It becomes it becomes a smooth space where there's no real difference between home and work, between leisure and you don't have that separation between play and work anymore. It's all the same thing, right? There was also, from segment to segment, the depression, loss of wealth, fatigue and growing old, alcoholism, the failure of conjugality, the rise of cinema, and the advent of fascism and Stalinism, and the loss of success and talent at the very moment Fitzgerald would find his genius. The sudden blows that come or seem to come from outside. And in the Crackup, which I just recently listened to, he talks about the cinema being like this idea that if you were a writer at the time in which cinema first became popular, what you noticed was a massive shift in the valuation of writing as the predominant means to communicate ideas, right? Because before the cinema, if you wanted to tell a story, to entertain people with a story, you would write that, maybe that would be turned into a play or something, like Shakespeare or something like that, or it'd just be a story that you would tell, but now with the cinema, there was a new means of taking those ideas and presenting them in a different way that had stolen some of the energy from what was previously invested in writers and literature, right? And out of this is similarly, you could see that like in, let's say, the advent of the internet and the digital age, that while we still have, we still have a movie industry, that the movie industry has been disrupted by streaming. It's there's these technological disruptions which are very much driven by capitalism and capitalism's ever hungry search for progress, right? So so you could apply the same idea to capitalism, but you could apply the same idea to alcoholism. You could have somebody who is defining their life through the segmentation of like, oh, I was a productive, sober, working member of society, and then this thing happened where I lost my job because it got replaced by AI, and now I'm out of work, and now I'm a drunk, right? And I'm going through this other phase where I'm out of work and I'm drinking and we have these ideas that we need to recover. We need to get these people off the booze. We need to get them back to work. But then what if they don't have the same place to go back? We have to retrain them. We have to redevelop this whole thing that had fallen apart. But the person feels like Humpty Dumpty that has fallen off the wall. They're traumatized by building up something which then fell apart, right? I mean, maybe I'm overselling it with the cinema thing or the movie industry, but there could be many areas in which people's livelihoods for their vocations are disrupted by the force of Techno-Capital, right? And proceed by over-significant breaks, moving us from one term to another according to the successive binary choices, rich, poor. Even when change runs in the other direction, there is nothing to compensate for the rigidification, the aging that overcodes everything that occurs. This is their line of rigid segmentarity that bringing masses into play, even if it was supple to begin with. But Fitzgerald says that there is another type of cracking with an entirely different segmentarity. Instead of great breaks, these are micro cracks, as in a dish. They are much more subtle and supple and occur when things are going well on the other side. If there is aging on this line, it's not of the same kind. When you age on this line, you don't feel it on the other line. You don't notice it on the other line until after it has already happened on this line. At such a moment, which does not correspond to any of the ages of the other line, you reach a degree, a quantum, an intensity beyond which you cannot go. It's a very delicate business, these intensities. The finest intensity becomes harmful if it overtaxes your strength at a given moment. If you have to be able to take it, you have to be in shape. But what exactly happened? In truth, nothing assignable or perceptible, molecular changes, redistributions of desire, such that when something occurs, the self awaited it is already dead, or the one that would await it has not yet arrived. This time, there are outbursts and crackings in the imminence of a rhizome rather than a great movements and breaks determined by the transcendence of a tree. The crackup happens almost without your knowing it, but is realized suddenly indeed. So part of this is like, if you go with this thing about segmentarity, is that if we accept the fact that instead of looking at this, it's like the whole thing about the ego and the id is that it's a very hard dichotomy similar, let's say, to rich and poor, or the proletariat and the bourgeois, or you could say there are these class segmentations in which the privileged are protected from the forces of economic austerity, of depression, of collapse. So there's a sort of thing going on right now where you have the sense that the rich and powerful are trying to create islands of privilege for themselves to protect them from things such as technological disruption, from global warming, environmental destruction, from crime and violence, all this kind of stuff, to these security, these well fortified islands of security or something like that, right? But in the idea of this is that if you have a certain process of something breaking down, there may be, in one area, it looks like things are breaking. Like if you look at, like, let's say, the privilege between being the wealthy elite versus the people who are in Gaza. The whole idea is that if by using these segments that they can create this one area where everything is total destruction and in another area where everything is safe and secure, right? Or this one area where things are slowly starting to break down gradually, the cracks are starting to show, but another area where we have a certain power structure that is resistant to the outside shocks and traumas and destabilizations, right? And what's interesting, what I actually find interesting about this is that if you listen to the right-wing accelerationists, people like Nick Land, who took this in a more right-wing direction during the time of Donald Trump anyways, there's this idea that, to his perspective, Donald Trump isn't really conservative because he actually represents more of like the chaos of the Republicans breaking down and this chaotic, insane thing that's happening to where there's actually a lack of privilege, because basically the people who feel like they're not represented by the power structure are using the MAGA maybe as a protest vote to say that the privilege that's taken over the Democratic establishment is not, they don't feel like it represents their interests. They feel like because of their segmentation of their identity, that there's a certain privileged elites who get to be comfortable. Well, they take the brunt of the pain and the suffering and things breaking down. An example of this, a great example of this, would be the recent thing about the steel mill, where Trump just made a deal to save the American steel industry by basically, I mean, the details aren't, I don't even know if the details are public, but he made a deal with the Japanese steel industry that it looks like, to me anyways, the simple version is that the American steel industry was going bankrupt and was at risk of laying off lots of steel workers, and that they managed to avert this from happening by letting Japan buy the debt but invest in the American steel, which is sort of equivalent to selling out to Japan, right? So there's this idea that you have, if you think about the power structure, where you have the elites, the owner class, and you have the workers, the working class, being separated by a form of segmentation, similar to like you can see like the wife and children at home versus the working man who comes back from the mines and he's all pissed off, and this is where the domestic abuse of the anti-feminism or the manosphere rage against the woman comes. That the segmentation, there's a resentment for the woman because she just gets to do the easy stuff, cooking and cleaning, looking after the baby, whereas the man's been sweating his ass off in the mine all day and he's pissed off at his wife, right? And the point is that the Marxist critique is that the man doesn't really realize that he's not pissed off at his wife, he's pissed off at the elite owner class siphoning all of the profits from his hard labor, and he doesn't see the benefits, and that these people then take all that into the Wall Street and into speculative financing and basically go into debt, right? The idea of like using the mining as a kind of collateral for which they can treat the world as a huge casino, gamble all their money away, and then when they are broke, they turn to the Japanese, so they sell out to Japan, so that basically this thing continues, but the person the man feels broken, the man feels repressed, is politically illiterate, so he takes the abuse out on his wife, or else because he's unable to see that it's a capitalist owner class that's profiting off of them, it now becomes an increased racial resentment towards the people in other countries who are now a elite class of Japanese businessmen who own the mines and profit off of the labor of the working class. So that's like a kind of a Marxist critique of some recent political developments. But this is basically what it's all about, right? That the American power center, based around America as a productive force, is beginning to, and it's also like, you could even have America is trying to shift its energy from being an owner class back to being a working class, but then in the process of doing that, they have to hand the baton to a wealthy Japanese investors, and there's basically this thing where the American exceptionalism, or America's number one kind of thing, is cracking up, right? Is going through a crack up. And could also be that the MAGA and Trump have only ever been a symptom of this crack up to begin with, right? So to keep reading here, this molecular line, more subtle but no less disquieting, in fact, much more disquieting, is not simply internal or personal. It brings everything into play, but on a different scale and in different forms, with segmentations of a different nature, rhizomatic instead of arborescent, a micropolitics. There is, in addition, a third line, which is like a line of rupture or a clean break, and marks the exploding of the other two, their shake-up, in favor of something else. This led me to the idea that the ones who had survived had made some sort of a clean break. This is a big word and no parallel to a jailbreak when one is probably headed for a new jail or will be forced back to the old one. Also interesting, keep in mind in current political events, that Garcia guy is back in the States. There's a jail. He's managed to escape the jailbreak, or whatever, escape the jail, but now he has to deal with being back in America. I'm not going to get into there's certain things that you can. I think there's something about justice and Pluto, power dynamics, oppression, domination, jailing. The segment, obviously, jail is a big segmentation. Anyways, keep going. Here, Fitzgerald contrasts rupture with structural pseudo-breaks in the so-called signifying chains, but he also distinguishes it from a more subtle, more subterranean links or stems of the voyage type, or even from molecular conveyances. The famous escape or run away from it all is an excursion in a trap, even if the trap includes the self-seas, which are only for those who want to paint them or sail them. A clean break is something you cannot come back from. That is irretrievable because it makes the past cease to exist. Can it be that voyages are always a return to rigid segmentarity? Is it always your daddy and mummy that you meet when you travel, even as far away as the South Seas, like Melville? Hardened muscles. Must we say that supple segmentarity itself reconstructs the great figures it claimed to escape? But under the microscope, in miniature, Beckett's unforgettable line is an indictment of all voyages. If we don't travel for the fun of it, as far as I know, we're foolish, but not that foolish. In rupture, not only has the matter of the past volatilized, the form of what happened, of an imperceptible something that happened in a volatile matter, no longer even exists. One has become imperceptible and clandestine in motionless voyage. Nothing can happen, or can have happened, any longer. Nobody can do anything for or against me any longer. My territories are out of grasp, not because they are imaginary, but the opposite, because I am in the process of drawing them. Wars, big and little, are behind me. Voyages, always in tow to something else, are behind me. I no longer have any secrets, having lost my face, form, and matter. I am now no more than a line. I have become capable of loving, not with an abstract, universal love, but a love I shall choose, that I shall choose me blandly, my double, just as selfless as I. One has been saved by love and for love, by abandoning love and self. Now one is no more than an abstract line, like an arrow crossing the void. Absolute deterritorialization. One has become like everybody, the whole world, tout le monde, but in a way that can become like everybody, the whole world. One has painted the world on oneself, not oneself on the world. It should not be said that the genius is an extraordinary person, nor that everybody has genius. The genius is someone who knows how to make everybody, the whole world, a becoming. Ulysses, perhaps, Joyce's failed ambition, Pound's near success. One has entered becoming's animal, becoming's molecular, or finally, becoming's imperceptible. I was off the dispensing end of the relief roll forever. The heady, villainous feeling continued. I will try to be a correct animal, though, and if you throw me a bone with enough meat on it, I may even lick your hand. Why such a despairing tone? Does not the line of rupture or true flight have its own danger, one worse than the others? Time to die. In any case, Fitzgerald proposes a distinction between the three lines traversing us and composing a life after Maupassant. Break line, crack line, rupture line. The line of rigid segmentarity with molar breaks. The line of supple segmentation with molecular cracks. The line of flight or rupture, abstract, deadly, and alive. Non-segmentary. All right, that's Deleuze and Guattari on the Crackup, and I wish all of you the best of times watching the Crackup unfold in real time, and stay tuned for more. I'll be back later. Thanks for watching.